The clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of conversation filled the sprawling, modern living room. Laughter spilled from the kitchen where Elena's friends clustered, their dresses sleek, their voices sharp with the easy confidence of the young and admired. Candles flickered in tall holders, and gold balloons swayed gently near the ceiling, each one stamped with a glittering 30. Margaret stood just inside the door, clutching a gift bag she had wrapped herself, pale blue tissue paper carefully folded, corners tucked in neat little triangles. She had worn her best blouse, soft ivory with delicate embroidery at the collar end, a string of pearls her husband had once given her, long before these kinds of gatherings started to feel like tight shoes 2 sizes too small. She smiled politely as a server passed with hors d'oeuvres on a silver tray, but no one looked long enough to meet her eyes. A few guests nodded absently, distracted mid-conversation, offering a mumbled "hi" before turning away. She spotted Elena by the Baradiant in a red silk dress, arm draped around a tall man Margaret didn't recognize. Her granddaughter's laugh rang out, bright and wild, and Margaret's heart lifted just slightly. She still remembered the days when that same laugh had filled her small kitchen as Elena sat cross-legged on the floor with crayons and paper, begging for stories about her mother as a child. She waited for a moment when Elena wasn't talking to anyone, then walked slowly through the crowd. The room seemed to part around her, not out of deference but disinterest, like a shadow slipping past unnoticed. When she reached her, Elena gave her a quick smile and a distracted, "Hi, Grandma," but her eyes darted toward the man beside her, already pulling her attention away. Margaret extended the gift bag with both hands. "I brought you something. It's not much, just something I thought you might like. It reminded me of when you were little and used to help me in the garden." Elena took the bag, not opening it, and set it on the table behind her without a glance. "Thanks." There was a brief silence. Margaret fumbled for something to say, something to bridge the space between them. Her fingers brushed her pearls. "You know, this reminds me of your 7th birthday. You wore that sunflower dress and insisted on carrying the cake out yourself. Do you remember? You dropped it right in the grass and started crying, and your mother—" "Oh my God, Grandma," Elena interrupted, her voice tight, loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "Do you always have to bring up some weird story from forever ago?" Margaret blinked, taken aback. Her mouth opened slightly, but before she could answer, Elena leaned closer and muttered, barely audible but crystal clear, "You're such a burden sometimes." The words cut through her like cold glass. The room seemed to tilt slightly. A breath caught in her chest and didn't leave. Elena was already turning back to her friends, laughing again, as if nothing had happened. Margaret stood there for a long moment. The party swirled on around her, untouched by her presence. She looked down at the floor, then around the room. No one had noticed. Or maybe they had, and no one cared. She turned without a word and made her way slowly to the door. Her coat hung on a hook by the entry, untouched since she arrived. As she slid it over her shoulders, the lining caught briefly on the pearl clasp at her throat, tugging uncomfortably. Outside, the air was cooler than she remembered, crisp and just damp enough to settle in her bones. She walked to her car under the soft glow of street lamps, keys already in hand, her steps deliberate and quiet. Inside the car, she sat for a moment before starting the engine. The silence was complete. She didn't cry. She didn't frown. She just looked out the windshield into the blur of trees and lights, feeling as if the last of something had quietly come undone inside her, and no one had noticed. Margaret's apartment was spotless, as always. The soft click of the lock turning behind her echoed faintly in the stillness. She set her purse gently on the entryway table, the sound of the keys against the wood oddly loud in the hush. No lights were on, but the glow of the street lamps outside filtered through the sheer curtains, painting the hardwood floor in long ribbons of orange and gray. She didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, she walked through the familiar rooms in the half-dark, trailing her fingers along the back of the floral-patterned sofa, past the framed family photos lining the wall. Each one had been placed with care. Elena at her high school graduation, Robert holding a newborn Elena beside his wife, now long gone. A picture of Margaret and her late husband, James, taken on their 50th wedding anniversary, sat at the center, framed in silver. She paused there, her hand resting on the frame. James was grinning, arms slung over her shoulder, sun in his eyes. She remembered how warm it had been that day, how full life felt before James died 5 years ago. She sat down at the kitchen table with a slow exhale, letting the silence settle around her like a shawl. It was a silence she had grown used, tune she had even learned to live in. But tonight it pressed down heavier than usual, thick with something unspoken. Such a burden, she murmured aloud, not to anyone but the air. Her voice sounded too loud in the small room. She could still feel the sting of Elena's words, could hear the precise cadence of her tone, sharp, dismissive, the way someone might swat at a fly without thinking. Margaret had always thought there was something still tender between them, something unspoken that passed down through memory and effort and presence. She had helped raise her, after all. She had rocked Elena to sleep as a baby when Robert was too exhausted to stand. She had sewn dresses, baked birthday cakes, picked her up from school on stormy days. But somehow, that counted for less and less now. Robert hadn't called in weeks, months maybe, though he always claimed to be just swamped. When he did call, it was mostly logistics insurance, taxes, updates on someone else's life. There was a warmth once, something real. Now it felt like obligation wrapped in politeness. He hadn't asked her how she was really doing in years. She stood again, unable to sit still, and walked slowly into the bedroom. The room was perfectly MadPillows, fluffed, bedspread, uncreased. She sat on the edge, her hand brushing the cool linen. Her eyes found the small jewelry dish on the dresser. She reached up and unclasped her pearls, the same ones she'd worn tonight, the same ones James had given her on their 25th anniversary. She set them down carefully. They looked out of place, no too elegant for this room, too much for a night that had ended like this. What had she become to them? A guest they barely remembered to invite, a figure of obligation who brought awkward stories and outdated gifts. She didn't want to be pitied, but worse so, much worse was being invisible. She leaned back slightly, letting her shoulders touch the headboard. Her eyes traced the ceiling, then drifted toward the window. Outside, a couple walked past, hand in hand, laughing softly. Margaret closed her eyes. She used to think getting older meant becoming wise, settled, full of stories people would want to hear. But it felt more like fading, like shrinking out of the frame of the picture, 1 year at a time. In the darkness, her hand found the corner of the blanket James used to pull over her knees when they sat together on the couch. Her fingers tightened around it. She was still here, still thinking, feeling, remembering, still real. But she wasn't sure anymore if anyone else saw her that way. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Margaret stepped inside, the warm scent of cinnamon and brewed coffee curling around her. It was one of those cozy neighborhood places with chipped mugs, soft jazz on the speakers, and sunlight slanting through dusty blinds. She spotted Helen already seated by the window, waving her over with a familiar, slightly anxious smile. Helen had been her friend for over 30 years. They'd met in a church sewing circle back when their children were still in middle school, and though life had thinned the threads between many friendships, theirs had held fast. Margaret appreciated Helen's softness, gentleness when others might be blunt. But today, Helen looked uneasy, her fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of tea. Margaret slid into the booth across from her. "It's good to see you," she said, setting her purse on the seat beside her. "I've been meaning to." "I need to tell you something," Helen interrupted, voice low. Her eyes darted toward the counter to make sure no one was listening. "And I don't know if it's even my place, but I couldn't not tell you." Margaret blinked. "What is it?" Helen took a breath, hesitated, then leaned forward. "I was at that little antique consignment place near the library. You know the one. I go in sometimes just to browse. Yesterday I saw something. Margaret, it was your music box. The silver one with the hummingbird etched on the lid. The one James gave you." Margaret's breath caught. She stared at Helen, confused. "I thought maybe it was just similar," Helen continued. "But I asked to look at it, and when I opened it, inside was that tiny note you told me about, the one James tucked under the lining. For all the quiet moments still to come." His handwriting. Silence fell over the table. The clink of spoons and chatter around them dimmed into static. Margaret's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Elena had that. I gave it to her for safekeeping when I downsized into this apartment a year ago, just a few months after James passed 5 years back, when I moved into the apartment. I thought it would mean something to her. Helen reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. There were other things too, I asked the owner. A pair of candlesticks, an old locket with your initials. It's all been sold already, but they remembered the seller said she looked like she was moving and needed the money. Gave the name Elena W. Margaret sat frozen, her fingers curled around Helen's as if to ground herself. The betrayal sank in slowly, not like a stab, but a slow, unspooling thread by thread of something precious. Those pieces weren't just objects. They were her history, her love, her life. She didn't even ask, Margaret said finally. Her voice trembled, but there was no mistaking the edge behind it. She didn't even think to ask. Helen nodded solemnly. I'm so sorry. Margaret pulled her hand back gently and sat up straighter. Her face was calm, but her eyes had hardened. It wasn't just things, she said, more to herself than anyone. It was trust. I gave those to her because I thought they'd mean something, because I believed she still cared, that she remembered who I was to her. Helen said nothing. There wasn't anything left to say. Margaret paid for her untouched tea and left the cafe with quiet, measured steps. The afternoon sun was bright, but it didn't touch her. She walked without a destination, her mind racing behind a face of stillness. Something in her had cracked, but not in the way Elena might have expected. Not into broken pieces, into resolve. That night, Margaret sat at her desk by the window, the one where she used to write holiday cards and grocery lists. She opened her address book, turned to a clean page, and began jotting names. Then she reached for her notebook, the leather one she had tucked away, since James died, and began to write, carefully and with purpose. The time for quiet hoping was over. Margaret would not be forgotten, and she would not be erased. Despite the wound from the last party, she'd accepted Elena's invitation, clinging to a sliver of hope for peace, or at least a semblance of family duty. The backyard was strung with delicate paper lanterns, swaying gently in the warm evening breeze. Laughter rippled from the patio where clusters of guests stood with wine glasses, balancing small plates of catered hors d'oeuvres and murmuring about business, vacations, renovations. Elena had spared no detail. There were floral arrangements on every table, soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, and a fire pit already crackling as the sun slipped below the hedge-lined fence. Margaret sat near the edge of it all, perched on a cushioned wicker chair that seemed a bit too low for her frame. She wore a lavender blouse and slacks that matched, her lipstick a shade bolder than usual. She had made an effort, even worn the brooch James had once given her after a Sunday drive, though the clasp was starting to loosen. No one had commented on it, of course. Robert had greeted her with a quick kiss on the cheek earlier, so hurried and preoccupied that he glanced back at his phone mid-embrace. Elena had swept past with a breezy, "Glad you made it," before vanishing into the buzz of her curated world. Margaret had smiled, nodded, tried to remain small, polite, agreeable. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, someone turned the conversation to childhood memories, an opening Margaret couldn't resist. She leaned forward a little, smiling softly. Elena used to line her dolls up by the window and give them names from the newspaper, she said, her voice warm with recollection. Even the obituaries. This is Dr. Harris, and this is Miss Maureen Tully. I once asked her why, and she said it was so no one would be forgotten. A few of the guests chuckled politely. A younger man nodded, clearly indulging her. But Elena, who had just rejoined the circle with a new glass of wine, laughed louder than anyone too loud. Margaret remembered how, at last Christmas's dinner, Elena had rolled her eyes when she tried to offer a toast and dismissed her with a curt, "Save it, Grandma." "Oh, Grandma," she said, shaking her head with mock affection. "You do love your little invented stories, don't you?" Margaret's smile faltered. "I mean, honestly, who remembers things like that? You probably read it in one of your magazines and thought it was me," Elena added, glancing around for shared laughter. Her memory's always been a bit flexible. There was a pause, then a ripple of polite amusement, the kind of laugh that let everyone else off the hook. Margaret's face went still. She looked at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Her thumbs pressed together tightly. "She used to say I had an imagination," Elena continued, shrugging, sipping her wine. "Guess it's hereditary." Someone changed the subject. Conversation moved on, seamlessly. The moment had passed for everyone but Margaret. She didn't speak again that evening. She watched as Elena glided between groups, tossing back her hair, owning the space in a way that made Margaret feel like a misplaced piece of another life. Every word, every sideways glance confirmed something that had been building inside her for months, no, years. She was not valued, not really. Her stories weren't treasures passed down through generations, they were relics, embarrassments. She had been generous with her love, her memories, her heirlooms. And now she was expected to quietly fade into the corners of every gathering, smiling politely as they erased the very history she'd held onto for them. When she finally stood to leave, no one tried to stop her. Robert was deep in conversation. Elena was laughing by the fire pit. Margaret walked slowly to the front gate, the gravel crunching under her shoes, the brooch at her collar glinting faintly in the porch light. At home, she hung her coat on the same hook she always used and sat down at the writing desk by the window. She opened her notebook again. Her hand shook only slightly as she turned the page. The humiliation hadn't broken her, it had crystallized something. Whatever came next, she would not beg to be seen. She would make them see. The night was thick with silence. The digital clock on Margaret's bedside table blinked 3:12 a.m., casting a soft red glow across the room. She lay on her back, hands clasped gently over her chest, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Sleep had been distant for weeks now, but tonight it was unreachable, banished by the weight of humiliation, the ache of betrayal, and something else too, something harder, colder, clearer. She turned slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. Her slippers waited just where she'd left them, aligned beneath the nightstand like two loyal sentries. She slid her feet into them and reached for her robe, wrapping it around her like armor. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant rumble of a late-night bus along the boulevard below. Margaret moved through the dark without switching on the lights. She didn't need to see. She knew every inch of this home. She had arranged it with care. Every object had a story, every drawer its memory. She stopped at the writing desk and pulled out the leather-bound notebook once more. It had become her companion these past few nights, its pages steadily filling with careful, cursive notes, questions, fragments of resolve. But tonight was different. Tonight, she opened the small lockbox beneath the desk and took out the documents she hadn't touched in years. Bank statements, old titles, a copy of James's will, business contacts long saved but rarely used. For decades, she had been the quiet one. The wife who managed their home, who balanced the checkbook and sent thank you notes. The mother who never raised her voice. The grandmother who offered support without strings. She had never sought recognition for the financial acumen she'd used to help James grow their modest investment portfolio, or the property she'd managed quietly after his death. Her name had never been in lights, but it was on the deeds. She wasn't rich, not in the way Elena's friends understood the term, but she had enough to act, enough to matter, enough to change things. Margaret turned on the desk lamp, low and warm, and reached for a clean sheet of paper. She began writing a list not of grievances, but of assets, trusts, accounts, relationships. She wrote names of people who owed her favors, and people who had always respected her mind, even if her family no longer did. This wasn't revenge. Not really. There was no satisfaction in hurt for its own sake. Margaret wasn't interested in spectacles. What she wanted was quieter and infinitely more difficult. She wanted to reclaim her dignity, to assert her value without apology, to remind her family and herself that she was not just a memory waiting to be faded out. A plan began to take shape, not one forged in haste or bitterness, but in the calm, precise logic she had long been underestimated for. She would make strategic moves. She would act carefully, decisively. No speeches, No confrontation, just action, the kind that left no doubt. She closed the notebook, her eyes heavy now, not with sorrow but with purpose. Outside, dawn had begun to stain the edges of the sky with the faintest brush of blue. Margaret stood and looked out the window at the quiet city below. She was done waiting for anyone to save her place in the world. She would make her own, and they would all come to see who she had been this entire time. The office smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish, a scent that reminded Margaret of old libraries and carefully guarded secrets. She sat in the corner of a private conference room, tucked high in a downtown building where no one from her family would ever think to look for her. The view behind her consultant's shoulder stretched wide, all glass and steel and blurred movement people going about their days with purpose. She straightened her blouse and folded her hands neatly in her lap, though her fingers betrayed her calm, pressing into each other with subtle tension. Across from her sat Evelyn Cho, discreet and razor-sharp, a senior advisor at a boutique firm Margaret had researched carefully. Recommended by a former neighbor who handled private estate transitions for widows, Evelyn came with the right balance of ruthlessness and tact. The kind of woman who understood how to get things done without leaving fingerprints. "I've reviewed the documents you sent over," Evelyn said, her voice low and even. "The capital you've accumulated is more than sufficient for your intended acquisition. The trick, as we discussed, will be ensuring your name doesn't appear anywhere obvious." Margaret nodded. "Yes, that's very important." Evelyn gave a small, understanding smile. "We'll structure the purchase through a holding company. The shell will operate out of a jurisdiction with favorable privacy laws. The offer will come through an intermediary with no traceable connection to you. You'll have full voting rights and majority control, but on paper, you'll remain a ghost." The language felt clinical, almost surgical, but Margaret welcomed it. It gave her distance. It allowed her to act without melodrama or sentiment. Still, as Evelyn began laying out timelines and legal procedures, Margaret's mind wandered for a moment. She thought of Elena as a toddler, running barefoot through the garden, dirt under her nails, cheeks pink with joy. She thought of the first time she showed Elena how to repot a plant, and the way her granddaughter had listened so carefully, lips parted, taking it all in like gospel. She remembered braiding her hair and reading aloud from the books Robert never had time for. It wasn't bitterness that rose in her chest now. It was something quieter, sadder. There had been love, real love. But now that love had become a currency spent too freely, and she was done letting it depreciate in value. "Will she know?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Eventually?" Evelyn paused. "Only if you want her to. The holding company can operate indefinitely under an alias. You could run it as a silent owner for years if you choose, or reveal your position later, on your terms." Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze falling to her reflection in the polished tabletop. She looked calm, composed, but inside she was bracing against the current of what this truly meant. "I don't want to ruin her," she said quietly. "I want her to understand something. I want her to see what she forgot." "Then don't ruin her," Evelyn said gently. "Buy the company, stabilize it, let her succeed under your watch." Margaret nodded again, slower this time. Yes, that was the path. Not vengeance, stewardship, correction. A silent hand guiding what had gone astray. She wouldn't strike, she would restore. As they wrapped up the meeting, Evelyn handed her a slim folder with preliminary steps and contact details for the legal team. Margaret held it as she might a letter from another life heavy with consequences, but also possibility. On the elevator ride down, she didn't look at the other passengers. She watched the numbers descend. 47, 36, 21. Her reflection in the chrome door remained still, but her mind moved quickly now, assembling the pieces. She stepped onto the street with the folder tucked securely in her handbag, a cool breeze lifting the edge of her scarf. The city moved around her, unaware. She walked slowly, deliberately, through the noise and bustle, a woman invisible to most. But not for much longer. The dining room was dimly lit with the flattering amber glow of pendant lights, casting a soft sheen over the polished walnut table. At its center sat an elaborate spread rosemary chicken, scalloped potatoes, a salad adorned with jewel-like pomegranate seeds. Robert had outdone himself with the wine selection, and Hannah had taken care to arrange the napkins into crisp triangles. It was a performance of family, curated for ease, presented as unity. Margaret sat at the far end, flanked by the quiet clink of forks and the occasional ripple of conversation that never quite made its way to her. She sipped her water and watched the steam from the potatoes curl upward, listening more than speaking. Elena arrived late. She swept into the room in a tailored coat, dark circles barely concealed beneath concealer, her smile tight and flickering like a bulb about to burn out. Her greeting to Margaret was hurried, a kiss on the cheek that didn't quite touch the skin. She was already mid-apology about a meeting that had run long, another investor pulling out, a vendor dispute. Her voice was too fast, too loud, masking something deeper. "It's just a phase," she said to no one in particular as she pulled out her chair. "Everything's going to smooth out once the new product line launches." Margaret studied her in silence. Elena's fingers trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of wine. She laughed too quickly at something Robert said, and when she tried to cut into the chicken, her knife slipped, sending a shard of potato across her plate. She didn't acknowledge it. Conversation turned toward the market. Robert mentioned something about tech stocks, and Elena launched into a tirade about how legacy structures are killing innovation. Her tone was sharp, defensive, her words laced with urgency. Margaret waited for a pause. "You used to say the best ideas come when things fall apart a little," she offered gently. "Do you still believe that?" Elena's eyes narrowed, not unkind, but impatient. "That was before I had payroll and lawsuits and people waiting for me to fix things I didn't even break." Her words weren't cruel, but they landed with a thud, dismissive, final. She turned back to her wine, already scanning the table for someone more current, more relevant. Margaret felt the familiar squeeze in her chest, not from pain, not anymore, but from a cold clarity that came from repetition. She had come to this dinner hoping, perhaps foolishly, that there would be some trace of warmth left. A flicker of the girl she once knew. But Elena was too busy drowning to notice who was on the shore. Margaret excused herself before dessert, claiming a headache. No one protested. Elena barely looked up. Outside, the evening air was sharp and bracing. Margaret tightened her coat and walked slowly down the block toward the taxi stand. Each footfall was steady, each breath measured. There had been a time when she would have gone home and written it off as exhaustion or stress. She would have given the benefit of the doubt. But no more. It was all there in Elena's eyes, the fear, the pressure, the need. She was flailing, and she didn't even know the hand that might steady her was sitting at the same table. Margaret didn't feel smug. She felt ready. The plan wasn't revenge. It was preservation of history, of legacy, of the truth they'd all forgotten. Tonight had confirmed it. Elena wasn't just vulnerable. She was blind. And Margaret would be the one to restore sight, whether her granddaughter welcomed it or not. She stepped into the waiting cab, calm now, with the strange serenity of someone who has already chosen her path. Margaret sat hunched slightly over the dining table, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, the only light in the room coming from a small lamp angled across pages and printouts. The apartment was silent, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of paper. A pot of tea sat cooling beside her, untouched. The world outside her window had long since gone dark. Stacks of documents lay sorted in neat, careful piles. Quarterly reports, balance sheets, shareholder communications, loan agreements. Some of it she had acquired through public filings. The rest had come through discreet legal channels, nothing illicit, just connections exercised quietly and professionally, strings pulled by people who owed her or simply respected her enough not to ask why. She had started with curiosity, then proceeded with caution. But now she combed through the records with a steady, almost grim focus. The picture they painted was not one of evil or malice, but of someone in over her head. Elena had made bold moves, but not smart ones. She had expanded too quickly, taken on too much debt, invested heavily in untested products that promised disruption and delivered delay. Several key vendors had severed contracts months ago. The silent retreat of investors wasn't personal. It was pragmatic. Margaret's fingers paused on a particular email chain. It was a tense back and forth between Elena and a supplier she owed money language, veiled in professionalism, but dripping with desperation. Elena had pleaded for more time, promising a new round of funding that, Margaret now knew, would never come. Her throat tightened. There it was again, that ache. That pull between sorrow and resolve. Her granddaughter wasn't cruel. She was scared. She had grown up surrounded by entitlement disguised as encouragement, told she could do anything, be anything, as long as she moved fast and looked confident. But no one had taught her to ask for help, to accept wisdom, to listen. Margaret sat back and removed her glasses. The room blurred without them, and for a moment she let herself simply feel it, the quiet grief of watching someone you love stumble again and again without ever once turning around to ask, "Wasn't there someone who walked this road before me?" It wasn't just that Elena had failed to honor her. It was that she had never thought she needed her. That, more than the debts, more than the arrogance, was what stung the most. Margaret thought of the day she gave Elena the music box, how carefully she had wrapped it, how she had explained its history, its meaning. She had spoken slowly, deliberately, not just offering a gift but entrusting a legacy. And it had been sold, like an afterthought. She turned her attention back to the papers and found her hand resting on a copy of the company's organizational chart. At the top, Elena Wembley, CEO. The title looked heavy, too heavy for someone still pretending not to flinch. And Margaret, quiet, invisible, uninvited, held the knowledge and means to take the weight off her shoulders. Not cruelly, not with glee, but with the grace of someone who had carried heavy things her entire life. She stood slowly, bones aching slightly from the long sit, and returned the papers to their folder with methodical care. The sadness remained, lodged deep behind her ribs, but it no longer tangled with doubt. She would buy the company, not to punish Elena but to preserve what could still be saved, to take back the pieces of herself that had been dismissed, and to offer, once again, the kind of stewardship that asked for nothing in return but recognition. Even if that recognition never came. She turned off the lamp, leaving the table in darkness, and walked toward her bedroom with the calm of someone who had already buried the need to be thanked. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in on the ears and made every breath feel like a disruption. Late autumn had stripped most of the trees bare, leaving skeletal branches to sway gently in the breeze. A few stubborn leaves skittered along the gravel path as Margaret walked. Her gloved hands folded over the handle of her umbrella, though there was no rain, just the heavy stillness of a gray, waiting sky. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, her eyes scanning the familiar path. She had walked this way for years, always alone. Sometimes on James's birthday, sometimes on their anniversary, and sometimes like now, when the weight of everything inside her had grown too heavy to carry in silence. His headstone was simple. She had chosen it that way, plain granite with just his name, his dates, and a line beneath. He loved quietly and with great strength. She brushed a few fallen pine needles from the top, then lowered herself to sit on the small bench beside it, exhaling as she settled in. "James," she said softly, as though he might answer. Her voice cracked a little. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I don't know what I'm doing. Not really. I thought I did, but now." Her eyes drifted across the rows of graves, names both familiar and foreign etched into stone, into time. "She's made a mess of things, Elena, and she doesn't even see it. Or if she does, she's too proud to admit it. She looks at me like I'm a relic, something quaint, decorative, not worth listening to." She paused, letting the wind answer in her place. "I want to help her. I do. I don't want her to lose everything, but I'm angry, James. So angry." Her fingers curled into the folds of her coat. "She took your music box. She sold it like it was nothing. She mocks my stories, my memories, and still, I love her." Her voice wavered on that last word, the edges of it fraying. "I've spent weeks thinking about what to do. I keep asking myself if this is just pride, if I'm doing it to prove something, to get even." She looked down, then slowly shook her head. But it doesn't feel like that. Not anymore. I'm not trying to humiliate her. I'm not even trying to take control. I want to protect what we built. I want our name to mean something again. I want her to have a chance to grow up, really grow up, and learn how to carry things with care. A silence fell, deep and hollow. Margaret stared at the gravestone, wishing just once he'd appear beside her again, that she could feel the warmth of his hand on hers, the steady gravity of his presence. You always said love isn't a feeling, it's a decision you make over and over again, even when it's hard, especially then. She sat there a long time, her thoughts unspooling into the cold air, unsaid memories drifting like fog. By the time she rose, her joints were stiff, and the sky had darkened slightly, the wind sharpening with evening. She reached out and placed her hand gently on the top of the stone. "I'm going through with it," she whispered, not for revenge, not to punish her, but to hold on to what matters. For you, for me, for the parts of her she's forgotten. Her breath lingered in the air before vanishing. Then she turned, pulling her coat tighter around her, and walked back down the path with a steadiness that surprised even her. The decision was no longer about anger. It was about love. The kind that endures betrayal and disappointment, and still chooses to protect what is good. Even if no one says thank you, even if no one ever knows. The papers were signed on a Tuesday morning. Quietly, efficiently. A signature here, an initial there. Margaret sat in a private office with Evelyn and the legal team, watching as ownership of the company slipped almost imperceptibly from Elena's hands into hers. On the surface, nothing changed. The name remained the same. The office doors still opened at 9. But behind the scenes, Margaret now held the reins, veiled by the layered protections Evelyn had so carefully orchestrated. There was no fanfare, no press release. That was by design. But rumors, Margaret knew, have their own way of slipping through even the tightest cracks. 3 days later, she watched Elena from across a crowded lobby. Margaret hadn't planned to go. She'd told herself she would stay out of sight, keep her distance, let the transition unfold without spectacle. But something pulled her there, a need, perhaps, to witness the weight of it, to see for herself what power looked like when it began to shift. Elena was speaking to a colleague in hurried tones, her brows pinched together, phone clutched tightly in one hand. Her usual grace had frayed at the edges. She looked thinner, her posture stiff with tension. The woman who had once swept through rooms with effortless confidence now flinched slightly when someone tapped her on the shoulder. Margaret could see it all in the way Elena's eyes darted, as if every whispered conversation around her was about her, and many of them were. Margaret remained seated in a low chair near a planter, partially hidden behind a potted fig tree. She didn't need to hear the words, she could read the panic in Elena's movements. There had been murmurs in recent board meetings, she'd heard. An anonymous buyer with significant shares, a shift in voting power. The board had requested new financial transparency measures, and key staff had begun discreetly polishing resumes. Elena had tried to quiet the speculation, but uncertainty has a way of amplifying itself. And Margaret watched it unfold not with malice, but with a cool detachment tinged with something harder to name. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something closer to vindication, but not without sorrow. She had expected to feel triumphant. She had imagined this moment once or twice in the dark, in the hush of her apartment, telling herself she had finally been seen, heard. She had imagined what it would be like to witness the turning of the tide. But now, with Elena's stress written plainly in her face, her voice rising just a little too high in frustration, Margaret felt the ache return. Her granddaughter wasn't a villain just lost. Proud, stubborn, drowning in expectations she was too afraid to admit she couldn't meet. She looked like a woman trying to outrun the ground collapsing beneath her. And still, Margaret did not intervene. She did not reveal herself. This was not the moment for confrontation. Her plan had never been to shame Elena, but to steady what had been tipping, to preserve the thing they had all forgotten to cherish. She stood slowly, unnoticed, and turned to leave the building. As she walked through the glass doors and into the late afternoon light, the wind picked up and tugged at her coat. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement, a calm counterpoint to the storm she knew would keep brewing behind her. She didn't feel victorious, but she felt certain. She had done what needed to be done. And whether Elena ever knew or not, Margaret would remain the quiet hand behind the curtain, steadier than they gave her credit for, stronger than they had ever imagined. The funds were wired on a cold Thursday morning. Margaret had watched the market that day from her kitchen window, a cup of tea growing tepid in her hands. Evelyn had handled the logistics, discretion guaranteed, the infusion filtered through a private venture vehicle created for this sole purpose. The amount was modest by corporate standards, but significant enough to stop the bleeding. Payroll would clear. Vendors would be paid. Panic, at least momentarily, would settle back into routine. Margaret had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the relief might open something in Elena. Not gratitude, necessarily, just awareness, a flicker of humility. The smallest pause to consider that perhaps someone had steadied the floor beneath her. But by the following week, Elena was on a podcast. Margaret sat in her apartment, legs tucked neatly beneath her, listening with cautious interest as Elena's voice rang through the Bluetooth speaker, vibrant and commanding. "It was a challenging quarter," she said. "But that's the thing about pressure, either you crack or you rise. And we rose. Not because of luck, not because someone handed us a parachute. We rose because I trusted my gut and made bold decisions when it counted." Margaret blinked slowly. The host laughed admiringly. Elena went on. "I renegotiated 2 major contracts, streamlined operations, and made sure we stayed lean without losing momentum. Honestly, the turnaround speaks for itself. That's leadership." Margaret turned the speaker off. She sat in the silence for a long time, her expression unreadable. The sunlight cut across the living room in wide bands, catching the edge of a framed photo on the shell phone of Elena at age 9, her arms around a crooked birthday cake, frosting on her nose, laughing into her grandmother's shoulder. It wasn't just the arrogance that hurt, it was the revision. The story being told with such certainty, while the truth, the quiet, unsung truth, was erased. Margaret had not acted for praise. She had no expectation of parades or thank you calls. But this complete blindness, this triumphal swagger, it stung. Not because Elena had claimed the victory, but because she had learned nothing from the fall. Margaret stood and walked slowly to her desk, opening the drawer where her notebook now lived. She flipped to the page where she had mapped out her involvement lines of influence, percentages of control, contingency plans. In the margin, she had once scribbled a single sentence: "Give her the dignity of growth." She stared at it now, the ink smudged faintly where her hand had brushed it. Had she done that? Given her a chance to grow? Or simply patted the floor so she wouldn't feel the impact? She closed the notebook, more carefully this time. Perhaps humility wasn't something one could offer. It had to be earned through falling, through reflection, through realizing the hand that held you up wasn't always your own. And Elena hadn't reached that place. Not yet. Margaret walked back to the window. Down on the street, a young couple passed by, laughing, sharing a scarf. The world spun on, indifferent. She no longer hoped for recognition. That path was closed, but the work wasn't done. Elena still believed she was alone at the helm. And Margaret, for now, would let her believe it. The restaurant was dim and quiet, the kind of place Robert favored: classic leather booths, wood-paneled walls, and a wine list thick enough to impress. Margaret sat across from him, a linen napkin folded neatly in her lap, her water glass untouched. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows, soft and rhythmic. Inside, there was a tension that couldn't be pinned to the weather. Robert had called her that morning with uncharacteristic warmth. "Just lunch, Mom," he'd said. "It's been too long." But Margaret had sensed something beneath it, a practiced ease, a smoothing over of something sharp. She had agreed anyway. He cut into his steak with precision, chewing slowly before speaking. "Elena's company's stabilized," he said too casually. "After all that flailing, she's suddenly thriving. A new supplier deal. Loans paid off, morale up. Even her boards stopped circling." Margaret nodded, eyes steady. "That's good, isn't it?" Robert didn't answer right away. He studied her, fork in hand, as if weighing more than just her words. "She's convinced it's her doing," he said eventually. keeps going on about decisive leadership and her strategic instincts. You'd think she single-handedly rebuilt the place from rubble. Margaret allowed a small smile. Confidence can be useful. Robert leaned back slightly. Sure, but the timing doesn't make sense. No announcement, no new investors, at least not on paper, and yet, a very quiet injection of capital and the exact right resources appear at just the right time. His eyes met hers, then not accusing. Not yet, but searching, calculating. She has no idea where it came from. But I have a theory. Margaret folded her napkin more tightly in her lap. Do you? Robert took a sip of wine. You always kept things close to the chest, Mom. Even with Dad, you managed the details. You knew where everything was, how it worked. That inheritance from Great-Aunt Lucileno, one remembered it but you. You don't miss things. She said nothing, letting the silence stretch just enough. I think someone who cares about Elena, he continued. Someone who's been disappointed, maybe, but still protective, might have stepped in. Margaret's gaze held his. She felt the room fade, her heartbeat even and slow. There was a time she might have flinched, but not now. Is that what you think? She asked, her voice calm. I think if that were true, it'd be someone who didn't want thanks or recognition, just a chance to keep things from crumbling, maybe even give Elena the illusion she'd earned her place. Margaret reached for her glass at last, taking a small, measured sip. She set it down gently. If someone did that, she said, they'd have to believe in the long view, that sometimes people learn better from silence than lectures. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. She doesn't deserve you. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Sadness, maybe, or weariness. She's young, she said. She thinks being loud means being right. Robert nodded slowly, sitting back again. Storm's coming, though. You know that. The board won't stay quiet forever. Someone's going to look under the rug. She'll find out. Margaret looked out the window, watching the rain as it thickened, streaking the glass in uneven lines. I know. And when she does? Margaret's voice was quiet, almost tender. Then we'll see if she can tell the difference between humiliation and grace. Robert didn't press further. He simply picked up his fork again and turned back to his meal. But Margaret knew the storm had begun to form. And this time, she would not be the one caught unprepared. The ballroom gleamed. Golden uplighting bathed the marble columns, casting long shadows that danced delicately across the ceiling. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and cameras flashed as sharply dressed guests drifted through the opulent space. It was the kind of event designed to signal not just success, but a rivalreal arrival, with capital letters. Elena had spared no expense. At the far end of the room, a raised dais cradled a sleek podium, flanked by branded banners and minimalist floral arrangements. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Tonight was billed as a celebration of transformation, a victory lap after the company's improbable rebound. Investors, journalists, partners all gathered to witness what many assumed was Elena Wembley's defining moment. She stood just off stage, hair flawless, dress immaculate, the thrum of adrenaline masked behind practiced poise. Her speech was folded neatly in her hand, bullet-pointed, rehearsed. She had told herself for weeks now that this night was hers. The proof, the praise. Across the room, unnoticed, Margaret entered quietly. She wore a deep navy suit with pearl buttons and a brooch at her collar understated, elegant. She moved slowly, weaving through the crowd like a whisper, eyes scanning the space until they landed on Evelyn Cho near the back wall. Evelyn offered the faintest nod. It was time. The host took the stage, microphone in hand, voice ringing with polished warmth. Tonight is not just about success, he declared. It's about resilience, reinvention, and above all, leadership. Here to speak to that journey is none other than Elena Wembley, CEO and driving force behind this extraordinary turnaround. Applause swelled as Elena stepped up, all smooth strides and lifted chin. She began with a joke, well-rehearsed, and the crowd responded on cue. She spoke of challenges and hard-won victories, of vision and discipline. Her voice held the unmistakable timbre of someone who believed her own myth. And then, "Before we close," she said, pausing to glance toward the host, "I'd like to thank our silent investor. Whoever you are, you gave us more than capital. You gave us time and trust." Polite laughter. A few claps. The host leaned forward, smiling. "Well, actually, Elena," he said, "tonight we're honored to welcome that very individual to the stage for the first time." Elena blinked, thrown. "Excuse me?" A hush began to ripple through the room. Then, from the shadows at stage left, Margaret stepped forward. The silence deepened, not with confusion, but disbelief. Elena's smile faltered uncertain, then frozen. Her eyes locked on her grandmother, as if conjuring her from a dream she hadn't realized she'd been having. Margaret climbed the steps with quiet dignity, her heels echoing across the stage. She reached the podium and adjusted the mic with a calm, measured touch. "For those of you who don't know me," she began, voice steady, "my name is Margaret Wembley. I am a retired educator, a mother, a widow, and until recently, a silent investor in this company." Gasps, a ripple of murmurs. Elena took a step back, stunned. Her lips parted, but no words came. Margaret didn't look at her. "Not yet. I believed in this company," she continued. "Not because of profit margins or market predictions, but because of something more fragile: family, legacy, and the hope that strength can be taught through love, not just loss." Now she turned to Elena slowly. Fully, and the room felt as though it were holding its breath. "I gave quietly," she said, "because I wanted to give you room to lead. I watched quietly because I hoped you would grow. But the truth has weight, and eventually, it finds its way to the surface." Elena's face had gone pale. She looked as though she'd forgotten how to stand. The silence stretched. Then Margaret stepped back. "I'll leave you with your moment," she said softly. "You earned parts of it, but not all of it, and I won't let you forget the difference." She nodded once to the crowd, to the host, to Evelyn, and walked off stage with the same calm with which she had arrived. Elena stood alone at the podium. The applause that followed was hesitant, fractured, uneven. And for the first time in months, she felt the full weight of the platform beneath her. Not a stage, a reckoning. The dressing room was quiet, its mirrored walls and velvet drapes doing little to muffle the storm inside. Elena sat on a small bench in the corner, shoulders rigid, fingers knotted in her lap. Her heels had been kicked off, her hair slightly undone from the weight of the evening. The door clicked shut behind Margaret, who stood still for a moment, watching her granddaughter breathe through whatever emotions she was trying to push down. Neither spoke at first. Elena's eyes darted to the floor, to the mirror, anywhere but Margaret. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was brittle. "You embarrassed me." Margaret didn't flinch. "I told the truth. You ambushed me, in front of my board, my team, everyone. I gave you the moment," Margaret said gently. "I just wouldn't let you rewrite it." Elena stood abruptly, pacing to the far wall, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "You should have come to me. If you had doubts, if you wanted to help, you could have said something instead of buying my company like some kind of test." "I did come to you," Margaret said. "Dozens of times. I offered stories, advice, heirlooms, memories. You shrugged off all of it." "That's not the same," Elena snapped. "No," Margaret agreed. "It's more." Elena fell silent, her jaw tightening. Margaret stepped closer, slowly, her tone even but not cold. "I gave you the music box because it was the most precious thing your grandfather ever gave me. I wanted you to have it, not as a decoration, but because it meant something. And you sold it. Along with the candlesticks, the locket, things your family carried through wars and weddings and losses." Elena turned, startled. "How do you know about that?" "I saw them in a consignment shop," Margaret said. "A friend noticed. I checked. The shopkeeper remembered your name. You didn't even try to hide it." Elena looked down, her cheeks coloring. I was in a bad place. We needed money. No one was buying. I didn't think they mattered." Margaret's voice softened, but the pain threaded through it. They mattered to me, and you never asked, not even once." The room pulsed with quiet. Elena sank onto the bench again, her voice small now. "I was scared. Everything was slipping away. I thought if I just kept moving, pushing forward, it would all work out. I didn't think anyone would understand." "You're right," Margaret said, finally sitting beside her. "Most people wouldn't, but I would've." A long pause. Elena wiped at her cheek, as if surprised to find a tear there. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? That it was you? That you were the one holding it all together?" Margaret smiled, not with triumph, but with tired affection. "Because you needed to believe it was you for a while. You needed to find your own voice, even if it cracked. But tonight, it had gone too far. I didn't want to take your power. I just wanted to remind you where it came from." Elena nodded, slowly, her pride finally giving way to something truer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For the heirlooms, for everything." "I know," Margaret said. They sat in silence for a while, two women bound by blood and disappointment, slowly stitching something back together with unspoken threads. And when they left the room, they did not hold hands or speak promises, but they walked out side by side. The morning light filtered through the cafe's tall windows, casting soft golden rectangles across the table where Margaret sat, stirring a splash of cream into her coffee. She'd chosen a table by the window, as she always did, preferring the view of the park just beyond the trees just beginning to bud again, unsure if winter was truly finished. Her hands were still, her eyes watchful. Across from her sat Elena. No makeup today, no sleek bun or curated designer wear. Just a simple gray sweater, hair pulled back loosely, eyes quieter than they had been in a long time. She held her cup in both hands, elbows resting on the table, her posture open in a way that was unfamiliar, unprotected, honest. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Elena said, breaking the silence. "I always come when asked," Margaret replied. Her tone was neutral, but not unkind. Elena nodded, taking a breath. "I don't know how to start." "Start anywhere." She hesitated, then leaned forward. "I need your help, really, truly, not just with the company with me, with how to do this the right way. You saw everything I didn't. You saved it, and I was too blind to even say thank you." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She let the words linger, testing the weight of them. "I never wanted to save you, Elena," she said finally. "I wanted you to see you were worth saving. There's a difference." Elena looked down, blinking fast. "I thought I was doing everything on my own, that if I made it look effortless, no one would know how scared I was. But I was scared, all the time." Margaret's voice softened. "You don't have to keep pretending." Elena nodded. "I know, and I don't want to. That's why I'm here." A silence settled again, but it wasn't tense this time. It was tentative, new. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, the same kind she'd used all her life for lists, numbers, thoughts, too delicate for phone screens. She set it gently on the table between them. "I've kept notes," she said. "Ideas, questions you should be asking, contacts you could build trust with again. I didn't want to impose, but if you're ready to listen." Elena reached for the notebook like it was something sacred. "I am." Their eyes met. This time, no defensiveness, no bitterness. Just a quiet, mutual recognition. "I'll make mistakes," Elena added. "Probably a lot of them." "You're supposed to," Margaret said. "But now, maybe, you'll ask before you do." A small smile tugged at Elena's lips, shaky but real. "Would it be okay if we started fresh? Not just with the company, with us." Margaret looked at her granddaughter, really looked, and saw something that had long been missing. Humility, openness, the beginning of wisdom. "I'd like that very much." Outside, a breeze picked up, rustling the young leaves in the trees. Inside, a different kind of growth had begun, delicate, slow, but no less real. Over refilled coffee cups and scribbled notes, they started again. Not as the past remembered them, but as the future might allow. Two women who had hurt and healed, choosing each other anyway. The office looked different in the morning light. Not colder, just clearer. The usual bustle of interns and assistants had quieted to the gentle rhythm of typing, murmured phone calls, and the occasional shuffle of paper. In the corner office, sunlight spilled across the glass-topped conference table where Margaret sat beside Elena, a stack of reports between them and a whiteboard filled with numbers, names, and half-erased ideas. Elena leaned over the documents, pen in hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hair was up, but messier than beforeless styled, more functional. There was no performance in her posture now, just presence. "We've been underpricing the Tier 2 services," Margaret said gently, tapping the column on the spreadsheet with one neatly trimmed nail. "They've absorbed more of your costs than you've allowed for, and no one notices until the margins disappear." Elena studied it, then nodded slowly. "I see it now. We kept the price low to look competitive, but it's bleeding us." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you try to look strong instead of being strong." Elena didn't bristle the way she once might have. She wrote it down. Staff had started to notice the shift not just in Elena, but in the quiet presence of the older woman now seen walking the halls or sitting in on meetings without fanfare. At first, they hadn't known who she was. An external consultant? A board observer? But over time, word had spread. This was Margaret Wembley, Elena's grandmother, the investor, the steady hand behind the scenes. And she didn't speak to impress. She listened, observed, offered advice when it mattered, and silence when it didn't. She never took over, never undercut, but her presence demanded a subtle recalibration in the room. Conversations slowed. People considered more carefully, and Elena, now, welcomed it. During one all-hands meeting, a junior associate had nervously challenged a proposal. Elena paused, then glanced at Margaret, who gave a slow nod, encouraging. Elena turned back to the young woman. "Let's hear it," she said. "That's the kind of thinking we need." Afterward, Elena found Margaret in the break room, watching the espresso machine whir to life. "You held back," she said. "You knew I missed the flaw in that model." "I did," Margaret replied, stirring her coffee. "But you figured it out when you gave someone else room to speak. That's how you build a team." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I'm starting to see what leadership really is. It's not just being the smartest in the room. It's knowing when not to be." In the months that followed, the company didn't just recover, it grew, carefully, sustainably, and the tone changed. Internally, staff spoke with admiration about the firm but calm way Elena handled stress. Externally, partners began to see the company not as a cautionary tale that had dodged collapse, but as a case study in measured resilience. At family gatherings, things shifted too. Robert, once suspicious and distant, now asked Margaret's opinion with genuine curiosity. "Should have had you in my office years ago," he said once, half joking. Elena smiled and didn't interrupt. She had learned now what respect looked like when it was earned, not demanded. And Margaret, for her part, didn't gloat. She simply continued to guide, to watch, to care. She hadn't wanted control, just stewardship. And now she had something better than either. She had influence, she had legacy. And, finally, she had her family's earn not because she insisted, but because they had learned, slowly and surely, that she had always been worth listening to. It began subtly. At first, just in the way people spoke to hers, lightly, slower, more attentive. At gatherings, Margaret noticed the difference not in grand gestures but in the small details. A seat pulled out for her before she reached the table. Someone pausing mid-conversation to ask her opinion instead of brushing past it. The space she once occupied quietly, invisibly, had begun to reshape itself around her, not out of obligation, but respect. The story of Margaret Wembley had changed. Where once there had been whispers of her fading memory or out-of-place stories at dinner, there was now open acknowledgement of her insight. The same relatives who had once exchanged polite smiles as she talked now leaned in when she did. They quoted her. They told others what she had said. Her words, once overlooked, had become wisdom. It surprised her at first, this slow, careful recalibration. She hadn't set out to reclaim her place in the family with displays of power. But in revealing her role in Elena's company, she had done more than reveal control. She had revealed capacity. At Robert's birthday dinner, it was Elena who insisted Margaret sit beside her. "We wouldn't be here if not for her," she said to the group, raising her glass. "Not just in the company, in life." She held more of this family together than we ever realized. Margaret had offered only a gentle smile, touched but measured. The table had gone quiet, a brief hush settling before the clink of glasses. Later, as the dishes were being cleared and laughter had turned low and lazy, Robert joined her on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee. "I've been thinking about Dad lately," he said, "about how much he leaned on you. We didn't see it. I didn't. Not really." Margaret looked out at the garden lights swaying in the breeze. "He never asked to be seen for it. Neither did I." Robert nodded, quiet for a moment. "You know, when I was a kid, I thought you were just background. Mom who made sure things worked. The person who made life easy without making noise. But now," he gave a soft, rueful laugh, "you're kind of terrifying." That made her chuckle. Terror is useful, in moderation. He shook his head, smiling. "You're not terrifying. You're solid, unshakable. I wish I'd seen it sooner." Inside, the grandkids were playing with puzzles on the rug, and Elena was pouring tea for Margaret's sister. No one was rushing her out. No one was talking over her. She was there woven into the rhythm of the room, no longer a guest in her own family's story. When she excused herself to leave, it wasn't a quiet slipping away. People rose. Hugs were offered. Hands squeezed hers warmly. Elena walked her to the car. "I used to think I was too different from you," she said, "that we didn't understand each other." Margaret opened the door, pausing as she turned back. "We still don't. Not completely. But we're listening now. That's what matters." Elena nodded, eyes damp with something unspoken. "You're not just part of the family anymore. You're the standard." Margaret gave a soft smile, something content and just a little sad around the edges. Not for what had passed, but for all the time it had taken to arrive here. She drove home under a quiet night sky, headlights tracing gentle arcs on the road. She had spent a lifetime being the foundation no one saw steady, unpraised, enduring. But now, finally, the ground beneath everyone's feet had a name. And it was hers. The morning was cool and golden, the kind of day that made everything feel lighter. Margaret stepped onto the balcony of her apartment, a cup of Earl Grey warming her hands, the scent of bergamot and steam rising into the crisp air. Below, the city-stirred buses hissed to life. Dog walkers passed with gentle chatter, and the sycamores along the sidewalk tossed their leaves in the wind like confetti. She had begun most mornings here lately, not as routine, but as ritual, a quiet offering to herself, to stillness, to arrival. Inside, the apartment remained as neat as ever, but something in it had softened. The music box James gave her once thought lost now rested again on the shelf near the piano, retrieved and quietly returned by Elena. The lid stayed closed most days, but just knowing it was there, intact and chosen, meant more than any apology ever could. The photo frames on the wall were the same, but they'd changed somehow. Not the picturist, the eyes. Her eyes. The woman looking back in each of them was no longer fading. She was seen. Margaret turned her face toward the sun, letting it warm her cheeks. It was never about power. That had always been the misunderstanding. From the outside, it may have looked like revenge or ambition or some final bid for control, but it hadn't been. Not really. It had been about worth, about truth, about being remembered as more than just someone who made herself small so others could feel large. She had not stormed her way back into relevance. She had walked, quietly, intentionally, through hurt, through doubt, through silence. And in doing so, she had reminded her family and herself that quiet did not mean weak, that age did not mean obsolescence, that wisdom had teeth, if necessary. Inside, her phone buzzed with a message from Elena, a draft for a new investor pitch asking for feedback. She'd answer it later, with care. Not because she had to, because she chose to. There was a trip to Paris in the spring, now circled on her Granddaughter museum tour, and a long walk through the Luxembourg gardens she'd dreamed of for decades but never dared to make real. She'd be going with Helen, who had already bought the guidebooks and insisted on French lessons every Friday over pastries. She was not beginning again, she was continuing. Without apology, without asking permission. Margaret took a deep breath, the kind that filled her whole chest, her whole self. Then she smiled, not because everything had been mended, but because she no longer needed everything to be. The cracks were part of the story. She wore them like seams in well-loved cloth. She turned and stepped back inside, sunlight trailing behind her like a long golden ribbon. Her life had not ended in the silence of others. It had begun again in the sound of her own voice.